Allen Allenzweig is a cultural critic and commentator who has published in numerous arts and general interest periodicals, including American Photographer, The Village Voice, Art in America, and Passion, the magazine of Paris, as well as the online journals Tablet, The Forward, and Poetry magazine. He's been a regular contributor to the Gay and Lesbian Review for some 2 decades, writing on film, theater, and books. His landmark history, The Homoerotic Photograph, Male Images from Drouot, Delacroix, and Maplethorpe, was published by Columbia University Press in 1992, and the paper-bound edition in 2012. In late 2021, Oxford University Press published his biography, George Platt Lynes, The Daring Eye, the first full-length study of the life and career of Lynes, a transatlantic gay cosmopolitan of the late 1920s through 1955. His personal and professional friendships included many major figures in the arts, including writers Gertrude Stein, Jean Cocteau, and Catherine Ann Porter. Visual artists such as Pavel Chelychev, Paul Cadmus, and Jared French, the cultural impresario Lincoln Kirstein, and choreographer George Balanchine, the trailblazing sexologist Dr. Alfred Kinsey, and the actress Gloria Swanson. Lynes became the intimate third member of a thruple comprised of a publisher and Museum of Modern Art exhibition curator Monroe Wheeler, and his longtime companion, the poet and novelist Glenway Westcott. Lynes' career encompassed fashion photography, the celebrity portrait, pictures of the classical ballet, surrealist inflected imagery, and extensive studies of the male singly and in groups that were rarely exhibited or reproduced in his lifetime. Allen Allenzweig has taught in the writing program of Rutgers University. So I will let you take it from here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your interest. As you see, it's already up. The very first slide is up. And it's, just to give you a sense of George's look at different stages of his life. On the left is the young George in 1927, when he and his family were living in Englewood. And on the right, George Platt Lynes. I thought this was an image from North Egremont, Massachusetts, because that's where his family had a summer home. But I've since recently seen an indication that this might have taken place, this might have been shot while he was living in Hollywood for 2 years in 1947. I haven't been able to research the exact location of that photograph. Here we have just a sense of who George was as a young man. He went to the Berkshire School, an all-male prep school in the 1920s, where, as it happened, the man who had become an important cultural impresario in America, Lincoln Kirstein, who's third on the left in that upper right photograph, shows Lincoln at that time. Lincoln did notice George on campus at Berkshire, and in his private diary, Lincoln noted that he thought George Platt Lynes was a sneering little bitch. And George probably did give off vibes. He certainly wasn't hiding his homosexuality. I don't think he was announcing it either. But there was something in his manner which, for those who had gaydar in the 1920s, they picked up on it. George left Berkshire. He graduated in 1926. He wasn't there for his graduation because his parents had already sent him off to Paris, where his mother's cousins, Kate and Walter Hardy, lived. He needed to finish some coursework in preparation for entering Yale. As it happened, Kate and Walter Hardy were friends of Gertrude Stein and Alice, and so at 18 years old, George Platt Lynes was introduced to Gertrude Stein and Alice. George was already keenly interested in modernist writing. So he impressed her immediately, and she began affectionately to call him Baby George. That was an appellation that kind of wore on him after a time. And he actually told her, by the time he arrived back in America, to please stop referring to him as Baby George. And she did. While he was there, his real education wasn't the coursework that he took at the Sorbonne or at the Institut Panthéon. It was really living in Paris and getting to know the cultural literary scene in particular. Because at the time, George really thought he was going to be a writer. That was his ambition. So he got to know, for example, Sylvia Beach, the owner and founder of Shakespeare and Company on the left bank. And of course, Sylvia Beach, Shakespeare and Company, published the first book-length edition of Ulysses. And you see on the right the interior of Shakespeare and Company at 12 Rue de l'Odéon. And Sylvia had her walls just lined with portraits of the various Anglophile writers who were part of the Paris scene at the time and who, you know, opened a subscription at her bookstore library. Now, at the same time, though unbeknownst to George, two American expatriates were living in the south of France. They had originally started living in Paris, but moved out to Villefranche-sur-Mer on the Riviera because Paris was too much of a hothouse. You know, and Glenway, who you see here on the right, and Monroe on the left, Glenway really couldn't get his work done because, you know, everybody was in everybody's life. Everybody was hanging out at the Dome or de Magot, and it was hard for him to get his writing done. So they wound up on the advice of Ford Madox Ford of going down to Villefranche-sur-Mer, where, as it happened, the Welcome Hotel was sort of the headquarters of Jean Cocteau, who you see here in a photograph by Man Ray. Of course, this wound up recreating the very thing that he had left Paris for, because with Cocteau living at the Hotel Welcome, everyone was visiting Cocteau, and everyone was in and out of each other's rooms, chatting, drinking, you know, smoking opium, you know, the things you did in the 1920s. But somebody had recommended to George that he get to meet Monroe and Glenway. This was at the time when George was back in New York. He had been at Yale for exactly a semester. He had disliked Yale intensely. It was too smug, it was too conformist, it was just not his scene. So he went to New York trying to find out what he was going to do with his life. And a mutual friend of George's and Monroe and Glenway's, a woman named, a journalist living in Paris named Bernardine Zold, recommended that George introduce himself to Glenway and Monroe. And she likewise had said the same thing to them. You have to know this young man who's just brilliant, George Platt Lynes. He goes to visit Glenway and Monroe. Monroe, as it happens, is absent from the hotel they're staying at, which is the Hotel Lafayette, the Hotel Lafayette in Greenwich Village. And you see here a note that Glenway wrote years later, the photograph that GPL fell in love with at first sight, early January 1921, the Hotel Lafayette, New York. Well, what he fell in love with wasn't simply the photograph. He fell in love with the man at right in the photograph. The man who's smoking a cigar, has this very dashing straw hat on. They're walking along the Promenade des Anglais in Nice, and he says to Glenway, now that's the man for me. Now, one has to wonder, did he not realize that Glenway and Monroe were already a couple? It's really not polite to say to one of the men in a couple that his lover is the man for you. But I don't think that would have stopped George in any case. He was just 19 and on the go. So he did get to meet them at that occasion, and the next night he went with Monroe by train. Monroe was invited to a dinner party. He did not go with Monroe to the dinner party, but he accompanied him on the train. And he made it eminently clear to Monroe, "You're mine. From now on, you're mine." This shocked Monroe only slightly, because I think he was also pretty attracted to the young George Platt Lynes. Anyway, in Villefranche-sur-Mer, after I wouldn't say the failure of the Hotel Welcome as a place to live, but certainly too distracting a place for Monroe and Glenway to live, they took a little villa on the hillside of Villefranche-sur-Mer that had a nice little garden, and there they are standing in their garden. And eventually, George does come over to visit. Now, this is already after George has established a relationship with Monroe in New York while they were there on business in 1927. And for the few weeks, really about 6 weeks, that they were still there in New York, George just got right into that relationship. He was already the third wheel in the relationship. So anyway, he gets invited to visit them in the south of France, and eventually he goes back and forth between America and France, establishing this thruple, if you will. And in 1930, they traveled to Austria and Germany, and it's really an established threesome. And early on, when Monroe and George, excuse me, I'm going to keep getting the names confused. George, Glenway, Monroe. The pairings get confused because their pairings were kind of confused. Anyway, Monroe and George go on a little honeymoon, and at the time, Monroe gives George an accordion Kodak camera, which was a kind of typical gift that one would give. And George starts photographing, not as a professional, but merely as, an amateur. But his amateur instincts were kind of good, because he sensed that little by little he's getting to know all of these famous people. He already knew Gertrude Stein. He began to know Cocteau because he became familiar with Cocteau at the Hotel Welcome. And so little by little, he's photographing famous people. And Monroe and Glenway sense from viewing a collection of his early photographs, he has a kind of native talent. And they encourage him, maybe photography is really your métier and not writing. And that was probably excellent advice because, of course, George really wasn't enjoying writing. It was too lonely a profession, I think, for him. He needed a profession that engaged him socially. And so he begins photographing people of some note at the time. André Gide, Colette, Feral Benga, who many of you probably have never heard of, I certainly hadn't, was a backup dancer for Josephine Baker at her Revue Nègre in Paris. And, she was the ne plus ultra of African-American entertainers in Paris at the time. And Feral Benga became something of a phenomenon himself and eventually came over to America and became a transplant phenomenon in the Harlem Renaissance. Romany Marie, who was a famous, she owned a famous tavern, several of them over the course of years, in Greenwich Village mostly, and her tavern was a kind of salon, not unlike the salon that Gertrude Stein had, meaning a place where all the New York artists, writers, performers went to just get to know one another. And very often she would allow people to simply pay her in kind. You know, here's a painting, Romany. George was quite enamored of her. They had a very lovely relationship, also because she read palms. And George was the kind of person who, if he wanted a sense of what his future was, he would go to a fortune teller or a palmist, and Romany Marie served that purpose well for him. Jacques Guérin was one of Monroe's, one of Glenway's lovers, at a point when his and Monroe's relationship was a little shaky. And Jacques Guérin also became a famous bibliophile, and he was a collector of all things Proust. And but for Jacques Guérin, we might not have some of the really crucial manuscripts of Proust that exist to this day, because Guérin collected them. And then, of course, Catherine Ann Porter, who was one of the writers that Monroe Wheeler, who was an independent publisher in these years, published when he founded a firm called Harrison of Paris. We'll get to know who the Harrison is of Paris. And here's Muriel Draper, another saloniste of this period in New York, and sort of a meeting ground for many, many New York bohemians, writers, left-wingers of all stripes. And as it happens, George, of course, did a portrait of Muriel Draper, who was, as you can see, a rather eccentric-looking person. And by 31, George's profession, mostly as a portrait photographer, but not exclusively, had really begun to emerge. And he visited Gertrude Stein at her country home. And by 1934, Time magazine, when Gertrude was over in America touring because of the success of the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, they cropped that photograph and used it on the cover of Time. And so really by the early 30s, George is not only a portrait photographer, but mostly and significantly known as a portrait photographer. And the Harrison of Paris, which is the publishing firm that Monroe created, he created with Barbara Harrison. We see them in this middle photograph from 1934. Lloyd Westcott, who we see here on the right, was the younger brother of Glenway Westcott. Lloyd and Glenway were from Wisconsin. Their father was a farmer. He was not a wealthy man by any means. And Lloyd came to New York probably to knowing that his brother would help him, achieve some footing in New York, which he did. He worked for a time in the publishing world, Glenway. And he and Barbara met very early in 1935 in New York, and they fell in love. Barbara was a woman of considerable wealth and status. Her father had been the Governor General of the Philippines in the 1920s, I think. Her family fortune out in California was in railroads. So we could easily say that Lloyd married up by marrying Barbara. I do think it was a real love affair, but it was, over time, a difficult, complicated marriage. By the mid-30s, George is well connected. And one of his connections was with, of course, with Gertrude Stein, who was the librettist of Four Saints and Three Acts, this odd experimental opera, which was composed by Virgil Thompson, with Frederick Ashton as a choreographer, and a cast entirely of African-American singers and dancers, and it was really a phenomenon. It premiered at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Connecticut, and eventually moved to Broadway. And it was the kind of phenomenon that at its premiere, wealthy socialite people, came up to Connecticut in their own railroad cars. And, also limousines lined up at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. It was that kind of event. And George's photographs of Frederick Ashton and the dancers were not for publication. Another photographer published the photographs that were part of the official program. But George never lost an opportunity to photograph beautiful men. And, this was a double whammy because he would get Ashton, the choreographer, and 3 of the principal dancers from the show. His connection to the Wadsworth Athenaeum remained for a time, and in '36, Chick Austin, the director of the Wadsworth Athenaeum, had a sort of, a spring cultural event, and Virgil Thompson was one of the featured players, and that portrait of Virgil Thompson was the cover of the program for that 1936 event. Jimmy Daniels was another cosmopolitan African American. He established himself both in Paris and New York. Ultimately, he opened up his own cafe in Harlem, which was quite a scene, and where a lot of sort of downtown white folks went up to Harlem to visit the Jimmy Daniels Tavern. Some other people that George photographed in the early and mid-30s, Katharine Hepburn, Muriel King, who was a costume designer and designed many of the outfits of Katharine Hepburn's early 1930s films, and Iris Barry, whom he photographed in 1940, was the original creator and director of the Museum of Modern Art's Department of Film. She was originally from Britain. And when Jean Cocteau and his then lover Marcel Kiel were doing an around-the-world trip, which Jean Cocteau lent sort of travelogue articles about for a French magazine in Paris. They stopped off in New York, of course. It was their last stop before traveling over to Paris. And they met with, of course, George, who they knew, and Glenway, who they knew, and Jean Cocteau with Marcel and Cecil Beaton, all traveled by subway, no less, down to Coney Island, and they went into one of these sort of local Coney Island photography studios and had their photograph taken. Meanwhile, in the same year, George took this marvelous photograph of Marcel Kiel, which I think you may be able to see from your seats, has a kind of drawing on his body, a line drawing along his arms and torso, and these are undoubtedly drawn by Jean Cocteau. Pajama, who I hope you've all seen here, back in the back room here. I don't know exactly how George originally met Paul Cadmus, but he did. And the two established an early friendship, Paul and Jared French, who were, of course, lovers. And in 39-40, Paul does this marvelous trio portrait of, their thruple. Jared and Paul had their own triad, because ultimately, in the late 30s, I'm not sure what date exactly, but Jared winds up marrying Margaret Honig. So there's that threesome, and then the Wheeler-Westcott Lynes threesome. And Paul did an enormous number of preparatory sketches of this painting. preparatory sketches, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, are not at Yale at the Beinecke, but rather down in Texas, in Austin, at what's the library there? The Ransom Center. Thank you, at the Ransom Center. And so, he worked assiduously on getting it right. The poses, what looks to be casual newspapers and magazines at their feet. But if you look closely, there are iconic elements to all of the illustrations in those magazines and books at their feet. And of course, Glenway is in the middle, looking, I would say, longingly at George Platt Lynes. Of course, Glenway was somewhat sidelined in the threesome because George and Monroe became the principal couple after Glenway and Monroe had been the principal couple for a decade. Glenway, I think, took this with good grace. But in any case, George, probably to keep the peace, gave his favors to Glenway from time to time. And it did keep the peace for a good decade. And Jarrett had his own take on the threesome, which it's not, in fact, this is not a joined triptych. These are three separate paintings that he did in 37, 38. So you have Glenway on the left, George in the middle, and Monroe on the right. And I would say the only feature that I think is a weakness is that they all seem to have equal stature. In fact, George was the least tall of them. Glenway was the tallest, and Monroe was somewhere in between. But nevertheless, it is an interesting psychological take on the threesome. And of course, they're friends with the three, including Margaret, and they wind up visiting Pajama, either in Provincetown or on Fire Island, and everyone gets, enlisted to participate in the Pajama photographs. If you're a guest, you're a member of the clan, and you are very likely to be enlisted in the portraits, rather in the performance portraits. And so we have here Monroe in Provincetown in about 1940 on the left, and George Platt Lynes in 1945 in Fire Island. By that time in 1945, the thruple was officially ended. They no longer lived together in New York as they had for over a decade on East 89th Street. And Jonathan Titchener, who appears in this portrait underneath George, was his then lab assistant and younger brother of a previous Titchener who had been George's great unrequited love. His former lab assistant, George Titchener, who died during the Second World War. And George took on his younger brother in both ways, in both senses, professionally and personally. And again, we have, I've always really admired the triple portrait on the right, which is hardly what you could call a portrait, but a kind of tableau vivant of Margaret George Tooker, who of course enters the Pajama crowd when Paul Cadmus and he become lovers, and Jared French, photographed in Nantucket. I just love the mystery of it. And I think you find this sense of time in suspension in many of the these sort of performative poses that are setups by Pajama. And on the right, you have Paul Cadmus and an unidentified figure. And again, this kind of mysterious time held in suspension. And here is a really, clearly a very posed, a quadruple portrait with George at the far left and Glenway pointing a finger at a figure laying down, which might be Jared or Paul. It's not clear to me which is Paul and which is Jared there. And George adopted a kind of pajama attitude in this portrait he did of Paul Cadmus on the beach at Fire Island in 1940. I think this could easily have been mistaken for a pajama painting. Not painting, excuse me, a pajama photograph. In 1946, 1948, George was out in Hollywood for 2 years, heading up Vogue Studios, and of course it was only natural that he was going to start photographing the new generation of Hollywood heartthrobs, including Burt Lancaster and the young Rory Calhoun, but also many of the emigre European writers who had fled Nazism, including Thomas Mann, who was living out in Hollywood in 1946, and Christopher Isherwood, who was kind of writing screenplays out in Hollywood at the time. And, but George had been photographing Isherwood since he came to America in 1939. So they had a kind of friendship, but not a really close friendship. And Thomas Mann, by the way, had been published by Harrison of Paris, the company that Monroe and Barbara Harrison had created that lasted for about 6 years, probably from about 1929 to 1935, and ended in part because the political tenor in Europe was getting increasingly dangerous, threatening, prices were increasing, so printing costs were increasing, and that's when Monroe, Glenway, and Barbara all came back to New York, and that's how their lives had to be recreated in America. George always said that he was not a surrealist, but nevertheless, when the opportunity came to have work of his included in a show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1936 called Fantastic Art, Dada, and Surrealism, he created this wonderful photograph called The Sleepwalker out of double negatives. I maintain in my discussion in the book that George, who wasn't free in the 1930s to declare himself openly homosexual, although in the crowd, the professional and personal networks that he was part of, it was no secret. I mean, it was hiding in plain sight. Everybody knew who everyone was sleeping with. But, you wouldn't typically have a male nude portrait or male nude study published in the kind of magazine that might be mistaken as kind of underground, fag rag or some such. But anyway, I maintain that this is a kind of declaration. Surrealism, of course, because of its, Freudian bent, could be taken as a sort of cover for simply declaring oneself homosexual. And the fact that the sleeping figure atop the lower portion of this beautiful pair of male legs with the buttocks and the inviting passageway to pleasure between the buttocks might well be what the man sleeping is dreaming about. Maybe not, but I do think it's a kind of dream image, of which George produced other surrealist dream images. again, without in any sense declaring that he was a surrealist. He didn't want to be part of any group, you know. He didn't want to be thought of as part of a school. He was himself. And yet, he did produce a number of surrealist-like images which have mysterious, dreamlike narratives that we can't exactly decode, but that's part of the pleasure of them. They're kind of mysterious. You can't exactly say what's happening in these narratives, but you can make up your own sequence of events, or, you know, you can try to figure out, you can try to decode what's really happening here. And of course, these were shot in his studio, and particularly the image on the right is in many ways classic studio George Platt Lynes, with this high key lighting and, you know, large shadows thrown against the back wall. And the shadows themselves become kind of, you know, elements, I mean, serious figurative elements in the pictures. His fashion photography career did take off. Principally he made his living as a fashion photographer from the 1930s on. He didn't always like fashion photography, in part because he found that he often had to come up with a solution to a problem on the spot. As much as he might plan it out, the minute he was in the studio or on location, he would find that, oh, this isn't really working the way I hoped it was going to work. But also because there was always not influence, the editors would be in touch with him saying, this isn't working, that isn't working, you have to do this, you have to do that. He didn't like that, as I think a lot of photographers working for magazines would. You know, the interference, editorial interference was the term I was looking for. It was annoying to George. But I do like, in particular, the image on the left, which I think is almost like, it's like she's like a piece of sculpture in that black gown, which, because of the angles of the dress, the cut of the dress, it's really, it's a wonderful piece of sculpture. And by the 1950s, George's career is not doing so well. Hollywood really kind of badly did damage to his fashion career, because by the time he came back after 2 years, other people had taken over, in particular, Richard Avedon. Richard Avedon, who, by the way, wound up taking over George Platt Lynes' Madison Avenue studio, the studio that George Platt Lynes had had for years, a very successful studio, became the studio that Richard Avedon took over. And unfortunately for George, Avedon's career really began taking off, and George began to be seen as kind of old school compared to someone like Avedon. George's connection to Lincoln Kirstein reemerged probably in the 1930s, probably because they met up with each other at Muriel Draper's salon. Lincoln was himself principally gay, but we can't say exclusively gay. He married the sister of Paul Cadmus, Fidelma Cadmus. And in the early 30s, he was extremely interested in ballet, very taken by the ballet. He was over in Paris, went to see ballet, I think it was called Ballet 1933, which was a series of choreographed presentations, including work by George Balanchine. Lincoln became friendly with Balanchine and offered to support his move over to America if Balanchine would accept becoming the head of a ballet school. And so began the start of what eventually, in 1948, would become the New York City Ballet. there were a series of ballet companies that Lincoln and Balanchine headed up throughout the 1930s, and partly because Balanchine's Hollywood career took off in the late 1930s for a number of years. He choreographed out in Hollywood. And so these are some of the ballets of that period. 1938, Billy the Kid. 1948, a ballet that I believe was co-choreographed by Balanchine and Jerome Robbins. And then Bourrée Fantasque in 1949, choreographed by Jerome Robbins. This takes us back to the first Orpheus iteration of a Balanchine ballet, Orpheus and Eurydice in 1936. But by 1948, Balanchine returns to the Orpheus myth in what was simply called Orpheus, and George photographed the two of the principal dancers, Nicolas Magallanes and Francisco Moncion, who were both major ballet stars in the Balanchine firmament, and he photographed them in his studio. The lyre is, in fact, a prop designed by the great Japanese-American sculptor Isamu Noguchi. Of course, these photographs were not used in the program because when George photographed them dancing, he photographed them in the nude. And by the way, very often when George would photograph choreographed material, Balanchine would stage the choreography in George's studio so that it was as close to the real choreography as George could get. He didn't have to simply ask the dancers to, oh, remember that step? No, Balanchine was there. The male nudes, George started photographing in the late 1920s and almost immediately began photographing male nudes, principally people in his circle. Of course, one of them, and this might, we think, be Lloyd Westcott in 1933, and a much later male nude in 1950. And I think you can see, particularly in the 1950 image, the extraordinary skill George had in lighting the male nude so that the nude becomes this incredible idealized sculptural element. One of his earliest interests was in the physique photographer, a man named Tony Sansone, who was rather famous in the bodybuilding world. And Sansone would produce his own commercial albums. And you can see here on the left how Sansone would present himself in a physique album. Highly oiled up, beautifully lit. But when George photographed him, there was none of that physique sheen. It was much more domesticated. In fact, it was very likely a setup in George's then apartment on the Upper East Side, or the Midtown East Side, in 1930. Farrell Benga, the dancer in Josephine Baker's Revue Negre, Bengal was originally from Senegal, of a middle-class family, actually, and he went from Paris to New York, and in New York, he created his own stardom up in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. And then a series of shots of nude youths standing and seated. By the way, George was not able to publish material like this. The male nudes of this period, from the 30s really all the way to his death in 1955, They were simply not publishable. Why? Because of the old Comstock law, which we may be hearing about now, which is maybe used to prevent the shipment of an abortifacient, mifepristone, through the mails. Well, that old early 20th century law prevented people from mailing what was considered obscene images through the mail. And it was still in place in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. So George had to be exceedingly careful when he sent out any photographs. And, you know, you just couldn't publish stuff like this in America. And I think you see, as much as he was interested in the male nude as a body, as an idealized body, he was also interested in photographing men of different types and different looks. And I mean, I just think the lineup there is interesting for presenting the way each of these models presents himself in the nude. You know, the young man who's sort of like, here I am, you know, this is all of me, take it or leave it. And then, you know, others who are a little bit more reserved. And the fact that they are really also portraits of character types in the nude, but definitely portraits of 4 distinct character types. And on the right, this sense of male nudes in a kind of circle, the camaraderie, the homosocial element of homoerotic experience. George would certainly have been aware of the male nude images of, Muybridge, and in France, Etienne Jules Marie, you know, man in motion, and therefore would want to work with models not simply posing for him statically, but, you know, in some sort of more energetic manner. And also, he liked the sense of the young athletic male, and always beautifully lit. The studio work is seamless across different kinds of things. You know, his ballet work in the studio, and the portraits in the studio, and the male nudes in the studio, very often all have this high sheen lighting and deep shadows, and a sense that the space is not readable. You can't quite see, well, how deep is the space they're in? You can't quite figure it out. I am always fond of presenting The Great Barrington Boy, which again is absolute classic studio lines because of the deep shadow thrown against the back wall. But also because The Great Barrington Boy, 1952, George grew up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts as a young man. And I propose that this young man resembles the young George Platt Lynes. By 1952, George is in his 40s and is past his first youth. He's still a very good-looking man, but he's not the young beauty he was. And I think that The Great Barrington Boy is George's, it's a kind of visitation of his own youth. And this young man really does look, in many ways, like the young George Platt Lynes. And man in his element, I think in its time, 1952, it would have been absolutely impossible to publish this for reasons I probably don't have to spell out. But nevertheless, you know, the idea of putting a white man and a black man together in this way, in, you know, this kind of clear erotic intimacy, would just have been immediately if the authorities got wind of it, he either would have been charged with a heavy fine or sent to the clink immediately. But I think it's one of his most beautiful, most poetic, couples, male nude couples. Anyway, I think he should be, I think he must have been very proud of it. And that's it.
Thank you for that beautiful presentation, and I look forward to the book. Did George Platt Lynes donate photographs to the Kinsey Institute?
He did indeed. Yeah. In his last years, originally because he sensed that, the male nudes in particular, he was worried about that legacy. What would happen to them if he died all of a sudden? And so he had met Kinsey in about, I forget when it was, I think about 1950. And Kinsey was immediately interested in George's work, in part because Kinsey, at the Kinsey Institute, was already collecting images of the male nude. And so there was this rapport between them. And yes, they began negotiating that George would sell at a really reduced rate the male nudes. Ultimately, Kinsey also had other genres of Lynes's, and it's a great experience doing research at the Kinsey Institute to see this work.
And that's the only way to see the work is to go there?
Well, it's the only way to, if you go there, have a research reason to be there. And
They're not available otherwise, they don't.
I don't know, it's really a shame because I think George expected that anyone would be able to see them at the Kinsey Institute. But as a research institute, I think they have their protocol, and so you can't just go in. They're not on the walls, Everything is in storage in an archive. It is available online when you're there. I don't know that you can access it online, but you might contact the Kinsey Institute and find out if any of the archive, the Lynes archive, is available online.
They also confiscate your phone, so you can take photographs of them.
Yeah, right. So, other questions? Yes.
I'll give you a question. Just your research, obviously, is exhaustive. Can you speak to one thing leads to another, and
How you mean how it came about that I did it? Well, originally, because I had written a lot about photography and art also, but I began to home in on photography in particular. I wound up writing a book called The Homoerotic Photograph, which was published by Columbia University Press in 1992. And each chapter concentrated on a pair of photographers. And when I got around to George Platt Lynes, I paired him with the German photographer Herbert List. And, I became familiar with George's work because in the late 1970s and early 1980s in particular, George's work had been kind of rediscovered. The Sonnabend Gallery did a mini retrospective in 1977 or 78, and it was a revelation. I mean, nobody had seen male nudes like this before, and it was like, where has this guy been all these years? How is it that we're only just seeing these photographs from the 30s and 40s and 50s now? And then Wood.
Sam Wagstaff?
Well, not Sam Wagstaff, but the guy who owned not Petersburg Press. Oh
Jack Woody.
Jack Woody, thank you. Jack Woody had a publishing company, 12 Trees Press, right? And 12 Trees Press, over maybe 4 or 5 years, published distinct books of Lynes' work. The first book was all of the genres, and then other books concentrated on individual genres, like the portrait. I can't remember all of the, or ballet, I think there was. So anyway, that got me started. I knew George Platt Lynes' work already and included it in him in my book. And little by little, you know, I saw more of Lynes' work occasionally being published here, being published there. And I, through a close friendship, was introduced to the George Platt Lynes family here in New York. His, not his brother, Russell Lynes, who by the time I got to know the family, Russell was already dead, but I got to know his nephew, George Platt Lynes II, and George Platt Lynes II's wife, Jane, and got to visit them in the house, which was the last place George lived before he died. And, you know, I felt an affinity with the family. And fortunately, when it was suggested to me through this mutual friend that maybe I should consider writing the biography of George Platt Lynes, I thought, I don't know if I'm up to writing a biography, but they gave me the go-ahead. The family gave me the go-ahead. It only took 12 years. So what's 12 years between friends? And they were tremendously loyal to me. Really, really loyal to me.
Did you have access to Fred Koch's collection?
You know, interesting you should ask that.
But he had so many letters and telegraphs, even Tishner's telegraph from the army that he was killed.
Yeah. Well, Fred Koch, who you may know of as the disowned Koch brother. Anyway, Fred Koch was a collector of George Platt Lynes' work. And one of the important curators, or archivists, I should say, at the Beinecke, a young man, young to me, Timothy Young, well, literally a young man, Timothy Young, said to me while I was doing my research there, or maybe at the time that my research was about completed, he said, you know, now that Fred is dead, no, actually, Fred was not dead yet. He said, we should visit Fred's home. He had an estate somewhere, and you know, I'll accompany you, and it'll be great. Well, it just never came to pass. We never got the go. And you know, I don't know. I don't know why. I'm hoping that the archivist, because there is still an archivist of that collection, I hope that material finds its way into some public archive.
Did he move it out of Pennsylvania and bring it to London?
As far as I know, it's still here in the United States. Is it? Do you know that for sure? Brian, do you know?
It's in Oklahoma.
It's in Oklahoma now. There you go, in Oklahoma, where everyone's going to flock to Oklahoma. It's not the likeliest place, obviously, but, you know, what can you do? Other questions? Nope?
Well, thank you.
I'm here to sign books if you want.
Yeah, and there are refreshments to enjoy as well, so take your time.
Thank you.